Well, Kevin, thank you for joining me again.
Thanks for having me on, Jason. Good to be with you.
Always a pleasure. And as requested, I've got Dr. Corsi joining us by Skype. Doctor, how are you today?
Good, Jason. Good to see you. Kevin,
good to see you, Doctor.
Delighted to be with you both. Thank you.
I apologize for the rough audio. It's always a challenge getting set up in a new location each time. But, Doctor, there was a lot of questions flying around after our last remote Skype meeting where we were at the Seth Rich press conference, and I know you had some questions that I thought Kevin might be best suited to answering, so I'm glad we can all three be here. Doctor, why don't you tell us what it is you have in mind?
Well, I think, first of all, the press conference was a little bit chaotic. The difficulty with getting the teleconferencing working and running in and out of the hotel room and where the press conference is being held in order to get a connection with this source named Luke, which is obviously a cover name for an individual who's not come forward to be identified. Now, the story is that Luke knew one of the two assailants who shot and killed Seth Rich, one having been a DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration agent, and the other an agent of the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and that they accosted Seth Rich and shot him, killed him, and that this was to take a thumb drive that Seth Rich had of the DNC emails which Seth Rich had stolen from the DNC email server. Now, what I'm suggesting, and the story was, I think, very difficult to, at this point, judge to be credible because we don't know who Luke was and no one's coming forward to validate it. And clearly the investigative authorities are not being helpful in this case, providing any information whatsoever. They want to shut it down. They want to cover up the investigation of Seth Rich's death. So what I'm suggesting is that we do a lie detector test on this Luke and do it credibly. I mean, there's good and bad lie detectors. We have to find a very credible lie detector administrator, and if he passes the lie detector test, then I think at least it adds a level of credibility to Luke's story, which could get us more national attention. And that's really the core of my idea that I've been proposing first to you, Jason, and now to Kevin.
Right.
See what your reactions are, what you think, and I'd like to have as much creative thinking as we could, so if this idea goes forward, it has the best chance of making an impact one way or the other to question Luke's credibility or to bring into a greater public awareness the possibility that Luke's story might be true.
Right. And Doctor, when you and I had spoken about it the other day, I contacted Jack Berkman, and he didn't hesitate. He said yes, that he'd be willing to do it, and I told him I'd get back in touch with you and we'd start working on some of the details. So we know that Kevin has a lot of experience with polygraphs, and I wanted to get the three of us together, Doctor, so you could hear his evaluation and his recommendations. So
I'm looking forward to it. I'm really pleased you got us together, and Kevin, of course, has outstanding experience in his intelligence work, and I really look forward to his recommendations and advice.
Thank you, Doctor. Yeah, I think it's critical that good examiner test Luke. Obviously, we know that there's all kinds of people coming from different areas out there. Some are real, some are not. So I think it's critically important. What is also important is who does the test. And I would find somebody that has been a certified polygraph examiner, U.S. Army, former CID. Those guys are excellent. A police department polygraph examiner, a previous one would be good. You have to be careful. Some of them use voice stress analysis, which is a bunch of baloney. So the first thing is getting a credible examiner that's been certified in the past. That's the first thing. The second thing is where the test is conducted. And you can basically vet the polygraph examiner by asking these questions. Where is the test going to be run? It's very important where the test is done. in a room with no distractions, a table with nothing on it, because this person's going to have to be put under a little bit of stress to come out and tell the truth. So an examiner will tell you where it's going to be connected. I can help vet that if it's the right surroundings. Then you got to be very, very careful what questions you ask. There are different types of tests. One is called a peak attention test, peak of tension. That's the one I like because it focuses in. Then there is the lifestyle general counterintelligence. There's several different tests you can do. So I would ask the examiner exactly what kind of test he or she is going to run. Run that by me and I'll be able to tell you if it's good, bad, or a waste of time. I've seen examiners do tests in their office behind their desk with the subject sitting there. That's never going to work. And then again, you need to lay out the questions that you're going to ask Luke ahead of time. A good examiner will know how to frame those questions. There will be control questions in there that are they're designed to test and see how the subject reacts to truth and lying. And then there will be the significant issue questions in there, which is the one you want to test on. They're all mixed in there so that the subject doesn't know what's coming up. So a good examiner is going to know how to craft those questions. Very important that those questions are crafted so there's no way to misunderstand what they mean. And an examiner is going to know that without a doubt. Then they're going to want to do what's called a pre-test. Pre-test is where you set the person down and you go through a list of questions on that subject matter. You ask the person those questions not being hooked up to the polygraph instrument. And as you're asking those questions, you're watching their body language. You're doing a behavioral analysis. And you can, with about an 80% certainty, see if the person is reacting to a question with a lie. An expert can. And then during the pre-test, you're going to tell the subject exactly the questions that you're going to ask him, word for word, no change. And what that does is that's going to raise his level of stress if he lies, because he knows what you're going to ask. He's anticipating that psychologically, and when it's asked on the test, if he's lying, he's going to spike. If you're using an electronic polygraph, if he's telling the truth, then it's going to show a truthful answer. So it's a complex process that all has to be put together in a test by an examiner who's experienced in doing it. I can help you vet an examiner. I've done a lot of this, both in counterintelligence and people entering into the CIA. I'd be more than glad to help there. I think if Luke is willing to take the test, that's a good sign. And if it's taken by a professional and he clears out, that's a very good sign. And that's a sign that you could use to take to the media. Polygraphs are about 80% effective. Anybody who says they're 100% is not telling you the truth. They're wrong 20% of the time. But in the hands of a good examiner, 80% is not bad. And then it's up to the tester to craft the questions after that. And that's where the expertise comes in. So I think, and I say this in a graceful way, but the burden of proof is on Luke to demonstrate that he's telling the truth. And as you know, that is so critical in this case. It's a mammoth size in the media and all over the net. So it's credible that this test be done by a professional, that Luke agreed to voluntarily to come in and take the test, and then the results of those released, I think will be very powerful in terms of which direction this thing's going to go.
Now, Doctor, you had, when we first spoke, I had suggested that perhaps Kevin could administer the test, but he's told me that he's no longer conducting the tests himself. Your license is no longer active.
Yeah,
is that correct?
That's correct. I'm a consultant at this point. You want to get somebody who's still certified, obviously, and still licensed. It's critically important.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, first of all, I think if Kevin would be involved to do all the certification and give a completely independent assessment of whether the person chosen and the methods used are credible, that's very important, because clearly I'm an investigative journalist. I'm not qualified to make those kind of judgments. I don't have Kevin's training. I don't have his experience. And I think we want this to be done in a way that is apparent to the public, that we're not trying to rig the results in any particular way, that we want to know the truth. And by my suggesting that we do this, but yet not taking the lead in how it's done, I think that adds credibility to the entire process of the investigation. And then I think if Kevin's willing, we critically, so much rides on this. If it's true that Seth Rich stole the emails out of the Democratic National Committee server, then this whole Russian collusion narrative loses a main linchpin. Because the argument essentially, at least originally, was that Donald Trump engaged in some kind of a quid pro quo, easing of sanctions, for instance, should he be elected president, more particularly possibly even the repeal of this Magnitsky Act, which seems to have moved center stage because that was the memo that this lawyer, Vasilkaya, however you say her name, when she met with Donald Trump Jr. and Paul Manafort at the Trump Tower, that was the memo she was carrying, was to at least change the name of the Magnitsky Act, but possibly even to expose this Browder, this investor, as a criminal and repeal the act altogether. Had Trump agreed to that, that would have been the quid pro quo. If Russia did not steal the emails, in fact, they were stolen inside job by Seth Rich, then the whole narrative begins to fall apart. So I think it's a very important investigation, but I couldn't agree more with Kevin that it's got to be done right. And that's why I think if we can recruit Kevin to take a lead verification role, it'll lend credibility to the whole effort.
Right. Well, I think we can rely on Kevin from our previous conversation to at least offer suggestions.
Sure, I'd be glad to
conduct the test. And
Sure.
Doctor, I think it's also important that we have Jack Berkman's confidence. So maybe Kevin could recommend a few people and we could offer those as suggestions to Jack.
In fact, I would recommend that you and Kevin take the lead in the discussions with Jack, and that I kind of stay in the background to report on it after it's done, and that way that Jack can have a greater assurance that there's no agenda or that this is all going to be done completely legitimately. And I think if the public is going to be believing it, they have to see that we've taken steps so as not to prejudice the results.
Sure.
We have to truly be willing to accept that either Luke is telling the truth or that he's lying, and that either demonstration is equally important, because we want to know whether this is an avenue to pursue or whether this is a blind alley.
Right. Right. Now, you've just raised a whole other issue that seems incredibly important, Doctor. The whole Magnitsky Act, the Veselnitskaya, Trump Jr. meeting, and Bill Browder. But separate from the Trump Tower meeting, isn't it true that Bill Browder has engaged in some pretty serious financial crimes? Putin has accused him and his associates of earning over $1.5 billion illegally within Russia, not paying taxes in Russia or the United States. And I also found it very interesting that Mr. Putin made the comment that the $400 million may have been sent to the Clinton Foundation legally. I almost felt like Mr. Putin was tipping his hat to Sunday with Charles, because he was leaving it up to Charles Ortel to determine if that $400 million had come in legally. Charles said there has never been an official accounting of a single $400 million contribution to the Clinton Foundation. So it seems to me something is there with this Bill Browder.
Well, I mean, first of all, let's go. Putin corrected it later to $400,000.
I see.
And how this all connects into Seth Rich is that if there was a quid pro quo, which would have given the Russians an incentive to steal the emails, what Putin is doing by pointing out this Browder issue and to ask for essentially the repeal of the Magnitsky Act is that it's pretty clear that Donald Trump did not concede anything on this before the election, because the Magnitsky Act is still in place. Donald Trump Jr. did not take the 4-page memo And that 4-page memo has been published by Foreign Policy, and it's available. You can read it on the Internet and Foreign Policy's website. And it detailed very clearly the fraud that Browder committed, that Magnitsky was not his attorney but his accountant, and that the money was gained in Russia through a series of stock manipulations and of various kinds that were creative but highly illegal. And the money was taken out. I mean, the key other elements are that the money was taken out of Russia through money laundering. And when Browder's original partner was Edwin Safra of Republic Bank died, the shares were given to HSBC Bank.
Did you just say Edward Safran, Doctor?
Safra, S-A-F-R-A, Safra.
Safra.
Edward Safra had the original shares of Browder's Hermitage Capital. He died, and the shares were then transferred to HSBC Bank when James Comey was on the board, and Mueller was head of the FBI.
Correct, right.
And the Ziff brothers in D.C., in Washington, who were some of the major contributors to Barack Obama. Probably the major reason financially Barack Obama was running for president successfully in both elections, were involved through Cyprus in a lot of this money laundering.
Right.
And Putin knew it, including money going to Hillary's foundation and her campaign as the money was being laundered out of Russia. Now, this whole Browder story is, again, very interesting, and Putin pointing it out is very interesting, because it also had an ambassador, Michael McFaul, who was there for Obama in 2012 in Russia, and began meeting with Russian opposition leaders to Putin and human rights leaders in the Russian embassy in Moscow, interfering in Russia's presidential election. So I think the Browder story has moved front and center. But to go back, in order to, I think, deal a fatal blow to Mueller's entire investigation and the premise of Russian collusion, is proving that Seth Rich was the person who stole the emails. And one or two ways: either Julian Assange will come forward and be given immunity so he can release the information he has as to who gave him the emails, or secondly, if we were able to prove that there was a government assassination murder, and Luke holds the key to that. So, what Putin is basically saying is that McFaul interfered in Russia's election, and McFaul had organized some $500 million to go into the Orange Revolution, which was in Ukraine, to oppose Putin's chosen leader in Ukraine, who, by the way, Manafort was representing, along with Tony Podesta. So this whole thing, while it's very complicated, Putin essentially dropped the basic key to, I think, unlocking a lot of the Russian collusion story. But it does all trace back to Seth Rich, and that's why, with Kevin's involvement, we can not only, my first idea was, let's see if Luke is telling the truth. And then I thought, especially with Kevin's expertise in understanding the deep state and understanding all of these connections, we can explore more fully how the Browder piece fits into the puzzle. And I think what Putin is telegraphing is that Russia's interference in our election, which even Rosenstein admitted in the indictment was not particularly effective and didn't involve any U.S. citizens, is very different than our interference in Russia's election, where Obama's ambassador to Russia was actively meeting with opposition leaders. That's after having funded the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. We're massively interfering in Russia's affairs.
Well, Doctor,
and Putin was pointing that out.
This sounds like typical Clinton-esque, Obama-esque, Alinsky-esque tactics, where they've just come straight out and accused Trump of doing exactly what they did.
Exactly. I'm convinced that's exactly what they're doing.
And so my time is limited, but I just want to, as we're doing it, I wanted to hear what Kevin's reaction is to this. And Kevin,
Sure.
what are your thoughts about how the Browder situation enters in?
Well, and I know you've got a time schedule, Dr. Corsi. It's interesting that the money was funneled through HSBC because HSBC was criminally indicted for laundering drug cartel money from South America and some terrorist organizations. They were criminally charged for doing that. None of the CEOs, nobody was charged, nobody went to jail. Guess who was in charge of that investigation? Robert Mueller. Guess who they brought in to handle the damage control? James Comey. In HBC at the time that you're talking about, and nobody was charged. Robert Mueller let them all walk, including James Comey, who was on the board of directors and witting of what went on. So that's a critical piece of this that you just brought up.
Yes, and Loretta Lynch was the U.S. attorney who settled the HSBC money laundering case.
That's
with
right.
the $1.9 billion fine, but no criminal indictments, even though it was a criminal charge.
That's right. That's correct. Yeah, big one. Yeah.
But still no criminals.
Right. That's right.
The obvious cover-up was astounding.
Yeah. And tying right back into, essentially, Hillary Clinton had set up a foreign political action campaign using foreign money, knowing that that information could never be subpoenaed or FOIA'd because it was foreign money, and this all was part of that international syndicate.
Well, Jason, I've got to go now, but I want to, Kevin, thank you very much for joining us. I'm really pleased that you'll assist us here.
Thanks, Dr. Corsi.
And hopefully take a lead in getting this done. I truly respect your work and your career, and I'm honored to be able to be working with you.
Thank you, Dr. Corsi, and the feeling's mutual. Same here. Thank you.
Doctor, I'll get back in touch with Jack Berkman, and we'll just keep moving this forward, and hopefully we can find a date to get this done very soon.
Well, Jason, I think you're in the right position. You were the one of us who attended physically the press conference in Washington where Luke was introduced, and so you have the best relationship with Jack Berkman, and thank you for engineering this and putting it together. Much appreciated.
It's my pleasure, Doctor. I'll be in touch with you as soon as I hear from Jack.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Look forward to going forward on this.
Thank you, Dr. Corsi.
Take care. Bye, Doctor.